Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to my channel. As you guys can tell from the title of today's video, I wanted to sit down and do all of my favorite Stephen King standalones. Well, not my favorite, but my top 6. I tried to keep it to 5, but I could not, so I'm going to do my top 6. I'm going to be starting from the one of the 6 that I like the least and going to the one I like the most and kind of going over with you guys why I like them, things that I like about the books, why they are so high on my list, maybe my favorite tropes within them. But I really wanted to sit down and film this because I did a book on my favorite standalones, or a video on my favorite standalones a while ago, and so many of them could have been Stephen King, and I feel like a lot of people would not have been shocked by that. So today I wanted to sit down and do my favorite Stephen King standalones. Maybe you're dipping your toes into Stephen King, you don't really know where to start. A little bit of a disclaimer though, some of these I have read a very long time ago, but also Stephen King's world, the world of Stephen King is very vast. So some of these do kind of play into other ones, and I'm not really going to be going over that. Stephen King is definitely one of those people who likes to break the fourth wall and put himself into books. He likes to put references to other books in other works that he does. He is one of those authors, and I think that it does create a very rich world, but it can be very confusing for new readers. So that's why the books that I have picked out today are ones that I think you can read all on their own and to enjoy Stephen King, but you don't necessarily need to be super used to or know a whole lot about the world that he has created. So the first book I want to talk about is actually one that they also made into a show. I think the first 2 that I'm going to talk about are like that. I really liked this book, and it would be Under the Dome. I think I really liked this book because this is about a man named Dale Barbara who is kind of fleeing some people. I'm not really going to go in depth on why because it sort of gives away a little bit of the story, but he actually ends up in this small town in Maine, and a dome, while he is trying to drive through the town, essentially is erected above the town, and no one knows why. And the reason why I really liked this book is because I love Dale as a character, but I also like all of the supporting characters, even the bad guys in the book. I like just side characters as well, but this is one of those books, because they are trapped under this dome and they are unable to leave, they have to become a little bit more self-sufficient, because obviously it's like living on your own tiny little island. They are unable to leave, so they need to work on food, they need to work on relations with each other. But this book is really cool because a group kind of emerges that becomes the rulers of the dome. And I really like books like that. I like when people just being people and becoming power hungry kind of become the bad guys in books. But the thing that I really, really liked about this book is it was not what I thought it was going to be. This is more of less, I guess I would say, horror and more of just humanity, more along a thriller line, and that is very different from what I'm used to reading, or was at the time used to reading, by Stephen King. Obviously there's something kind of a little bit weird going on because there's a giant dome erected above a town. How does that even happen? But what really got me about this book is just the humanity, and for me that is always 100% more scary than blood and gore and monsters. So if you like that kind of book, I think you'll really like this one. Now, the next one I talk about is actually also been made into a show, and I think it is probably the best book-to-movie or book-to-show adaptation they've ever done of a Stephen King book, and it'd be 11/22/63. I do not like the actor that actually plays our main character, Jake, in the show normally, but he does Jake very well. What the book follows, however, is Jake is just a high school teacher, and he's actually reading a letter from, I believe, their janitor about how he survives the sledgehammer murder of his father. His father tried to kill his entire family, and he actually survives. And the reason why this book is really cool is because, once again, there's a lot of humanity in it, but the storyline gets a little bit more Stephen King-esque when his friend, Jake's friend, is actually a diner owner, and he asks him one day to come in, and when he goes in to see him, he looks like he's aged, 10 years, he's dying of cancer at this point in time, and the owner actually tells him, his friend tells him, that there's a portal in the back of his diner that he can walk through to actually go back in time. And what this book revolves around is Jake actually trying to stop the Kennedy assassination. I read this book in all its glory, I don't know if you can tell, it's the size of my freaking head, in about 2 days. I inhaled this book. I thought it was so cool. There's so many Stephen King references in it, but I don't necessarily think it's a book that you need to know a whole lot of the world, about the world, to get. You're not going to hear something and kind of wonder, okay, that feels like it might be something Stephen King, but it's not something I understand. It doesn't make you feel like that at all. But there are little references in here, so if you are a Stephen King fan and you haven't read this, I think that you'll really enjoy it. I just loved this book. I think that, once again, this is a lot more about people and what people are capable of, because in this book, obviously, since it does start out following the gentleman at his school, the janitor at his school, and how his father tries to murder his entire family, this is a lot more about what people are capable of. And I think that, once again, that is like my new favorite thing from Stephen King. I really like his books like that. I think that he does a really good job of painting men more as monsters than necessarily like the spoopy stuff. Now, the next book I want to talk about is actually one of my most favorite Stephen King books of all time, and that would be Revival. I feel like this one kind of went under the radar for a lot of long-term Stephen King fans, which is kind of unfortunate because I feel like this book, a lot of people would enjoy if they sat down and took the time to read it, but I feel like the plot line and the way it's pitched to people was a little bit confusing. This book actually follows our main character Jamie from a time when he is very, very young. He actually meets a new preacher. His name is Charles. He moves to the small town that Jamie lives in and becomes the new preacher and starts redoing their church and things like that. But the thing about the new preacher that is different is he's also really science-based. He does show them how to do things just because of science. Like there's like a little miniature, I think, replica in the basement, and he's able to move things around, and the kids are like, oh, it's magic, it's, you know, God. And he's like, no, it's science, and kind of talks to them about it. But a tragedy befalls the pastor, and a tragedy also befalls Jamie. And the reason why I really like this book is the pastor kind of goes, you know what, screw God, screw everything, I don't believe in anything anymore, and flees the town. He's essentially banished from the town. And the book picks up a little bit later with Jamie as an adult. He is in a band, he plays guitar, but he is also a heroin addict, and he's just kind of living on the streets when he once again meets our pastor Charles. And I'm not going to go too in depth on what happens from there, but this book is not what you think it's going to be at all. I think Charles is such a good villain as well, because he kind of uses people in a way that will benefit him, but also in a way where he thinks he's helping. This book is a lot about Charles trying to help Jamie, get clean, or at least you think that's what's happening. This book, I feel like a lot more people would have loved than I see it around. I have honestly never seen anyone talk about this one, and I don't know why. I read it, I think, in 5 hours. That's how much I loved it. I just inhaled it. I think that the God aspect, like the God versus science aspect as well, I think Stephen King does that very well. I think he's definitely one of those authors who thinks he's pretty intelligent and likes to be, likes to theorize on things, and he's very political. If you follow him on Twitter, you've seen that around, and I feel like there's a little bit of that in this, but I still think it's done in a very tactful kind of way, and I think a lot of people would read this. If you are a Stephen King fan and you haven't read this, please read this and let me know what you think, because I need someone else's opinion on this damn book. Now, this next book I'm not going to linger on for too long because I've talked about it before, but that'd be Needful Things. Needful Things, I think, is the quintessential Slytherin read, honestly. This follows a very small town, Castle Rock, Maine, as you guys know, is where this book takes place. This is a city, like a small town that Stephen King uses a lot in his novels, and I think that there's a very specific reason for that. I think creating a location and kind of keeping his world sort of contained in that was very smart on his part, because he can kind of move it around and change it. And it's not necessarily one, obviously because it's made up, that people are familiar with, so there's no holes that people can kind of punch in the city. But the reason why I really like this book is because of our villain, Leland Gaunt. There are obviously a ton of characters in this book. He does run a shop called Needful Things where you can go in to purchase whatever your heart desires, and he has a knack for having things available that people just genuinely want. But to purchase them, you do have to pay a price, and the price can be very high or it can be very low, depending. It's more about what you're willing to pay for the thing that you think that you really, really need or really, really want. And the reason why I love this story so, so much is Leland doesn't really have anything to gain from it. I feel like, obviously, throughout the story, he later on starts asking people to do things for him, but it's more so to stir up trouble. It's more so to cause problems in the town. It is in no way really, I think, to benefit him. It's more of like a social experiment. And this is, once again, one of those books where I feel like there is a lot of horror aspect to this. There is obviously like murder and things like that, and it is very dark. I feel like the setting of this book is very dark. When I was reading it, I pictured it like I was reading it 24/7 at night, like that it was just night here all the time, and it's not. But that's kind of the vibe that I got from this book. It is very dark, and it is more on the horror side of things, because like I said, Leland is asking people to do things that are not necessarily right in the world. But I really liked this book. Like I said, I've kind of gone over it before. It is very hefty. It is obviously one of his more bigger hardcover books, but I think it's definitely worth the read if you're wanting something very dark, but, very more horror like Stephen King does, but also more just about people and what people are capable of, because I think that is definitely what this book is about, because people go to Leland and they want to purchase things, and he asks them, how bad do you want this thing? Are you willing to do this? And you'll be surprised how often people say yes, they are. Now, the second to last book that I have here, I am so excited to talk about. This is a book that I always recommend to people. This is a movie I always recommend to people. I feel like this is one of the very first big budget Stephen King movies that they ended up doing, aside from, I would say, like Shawshank Redemption and aside from The Green Mile. This is a book that I think I really need to sit down and reread because I loved it so much, and there's so much about it that I just want to like take back in and reread and experience again, and that would be Dreamcatcher. If you guys are not familiar, they did make this into a movie. I believe Morgan Freeman is in it, and it's really cool. But what this follows is, this is once again in Derry. It follows 4 boys who are protecting a mentally handicapped kid in their town, and they do something that is slightly unforgivable, but I think is kind of described as it was a good thing that they did, but a hard thing that they did. They made a right choice, but they did something that would forever really kind of affect their lives. But each year, later on, the boys obviously grow up. They are men. They have separate lives. Everyone is doing their own thing. But each year they go back to Derry to go hunting in the woods. And they rent this cabin, and they have like a big blowout bash. They all, just get drunk and hang out and really reconnect with each other. But somebody actually stumbles into their camp and is talking about the lights in the sky, and he's got these growths all over his body. It kind of looks like red moss all over his body. And the story from there, the reason why I loved this book so much is, yes, there are obviously extraterrestrials. I think there's definitely more alien, demon kind of things that happen in this book. It's never really 100% talked about, but it's one of those books that leaves you to kind of figure out, sort of like Tommyknockers, like what's really going on. But the reason why I like this is at one point in time, there's a lot of internal, like literally internal, like they go into their minds to kind of figure out things, to relive the past, to see where they went wrong, to kind of reconnect with each other and protect each other. That aspect of this book, when I read this book, was so deep and profound to me, like doing the right thing, but wondering if you did the right thing. That is all that this book is about. And while there is death and there is gore and there is, this extraterrestrial being that is hunting them, I think that that's really the aspect of this that I really loved. 4 boys, genuine love for each other, lost in the woods, under attack. What will they do or not do to protect each other? And that's why I really like this book. If you like desolate books, like in the middle of the woods, like away from towns and cities, I think you'll really like this one as well. And if you like that boy story, about boys who just grow up together and love each other like a boy's tale, I think you'll really like this as well. Now, the next book I want to talk about is actually a book that I stole from my middle grade teacher, Mrs. Graham. If magically you were watching this, I'm really sorry, but it is my most favorite Stephen King book of all time. I'm going to go ahead and let you know, though, do not watch the Netflix special of this. It is absolute garbage. That would be Bag of Bones. What don't I like about this novel? This novel has everything in it that I think that I really needed at the time. Don't ask me why I needed this kind of book in the 8th grade, but I really did. This is about an author whose wife, his name is Mike, his wife suddenly dies. And this book, it takes place about 4 years later. And he's still grieving from the death of his wife. And he's unable to move on. He's unable to write. He's one of those authors who kind of writes and puts a bunch of books in storage. And then when he has any kind of like lull in writing, he sort of releases them. Which, by the way, I think Stephen King does, because there's not a chance in hell that he's releasing like 2 or 3 books a year, just able to do that. I think that he was sort of writing himself into this as well. But Mike one day decides that he needs to get away. He needs to go back to the town once again in Maine that he knows and loves, his little Yankee town as they call it in the book. And he goes back to him and his wife Joe's cabin, and it is called Sarah Laughs. And yeah, it's a little bit of a weird name, but he wants to disconnect but also reconnect. So he's wanting to kind of run away from the death of his wife but also reconnect with writing. But he starts to experience things in Sarah Laughs that don't make sense to him. A lot of nightmares, a lot of like ghost stuff starts happening. But what runs beneath this novel that I really, really liked is the relationships that Mike actually builds. But what I really like about this book is actually our bad guy. There's a gentleman called Max who actually sort of takes the town under control. He's like a really big, rich guy who can kind of do whatever he wants within the town. And he has a young daughter who has an even younger child. Like, she is a very young, unwed mother, and Max wants to actually take the daughter from him, and there's reasons unknown in the book, like, obviously I'm not going to go over them with you, that you kind of learn later about why Max wants to do that. This is more of a book about love, because obviously Mike does start to fall for her and does start to care for them and does start to want to help them. So this is a book I feel is more about, while it does have ghosts and spooky things that have in it that are very Stephen King-esque, this is also just a love story at its core. And I think it's done very well. I think it's a love story, but it also talks about the dark places of people, like our darkest places, like within Mike and his loss of his wife, or with Max and his greed and wanting to control his granddaughter, and his daughter wanting to do whatever she can to protect her daughter. And I really liked that. I really, really loved this book. It was definitely something that I needed to read when I read it. I'm doing a very bad job, I think, of explaining it, but just know that this is a love story. It is a spooky story. It is a story about an author trying to just write again and learning about loss and moving on from loss. If you've lost someone recently, I think this will be a really good book for that as well. It was just so much deeper than I was used to for Stephen King, and Stephen King writes pretty freaking deep all the time already. Alright guys, so that is it for today's video. I hope I was able to kind of go through why I liked these books in a way that sort of made sense. Stephen King is an author for me that I just generally know when I go to pick something up from him that I'm going to love it, because it has him all over it. There's so much Stephen King in the Stephen King that I read. Like, I could read an excerpt from something and just know that it was something that he's written, because I've read so much. He feels like an old friend to me, that reading anything by him, I just know that I'm going to love it. But I hope I was able to kind of push past the emotions of a book and the way that the book made me feel, and kind of go over with you guys why I really liked them. Now, there are other books that I didn't include in this, let's say Doomakey, Tommy Knockers, other books that I just really liked from him that I didn't want to include in this because I've already spoke about them before. But I hope you guys like the ones that I suggested. If you do read any of these, or you have read any of these, let me know down below if you liked them. But I hope you guys are having a good week. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and think about subscribing, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye!